Disaster and Death. In 1893, one of the worst panics in the history of the United States occurred. Banks closed and never reopened, businesses failed, and some of the railroads even went bankrupt. Even though Mark Twain went back to New York, there was nothing he could do. He lost practically everything. The publishing company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The typesetting machine was still not ready for use. Mark Twain could see no way out. Day after day, he stayed in a small, cheap room, overcome with the prospect of ruin. He did not know which way to turn. Every day, new debts were piling up, and he had no more money, no way of getting any more. He wanted to sell the publishing businesses, but the manager would not agree. Peggy said his machine was soon to be in operating order, but even Mark Twain had by now lost faith in it. For the first time in his life, he felt completely defeated. He had been in trouble in 1891 when he had taken the family to Europe, but he had still believed in his ability to write books and make enough money to keep the publishing company going, to keep Peggy supplied with necessary funds and his family provided for. It was true that the family had been living in reduced circumstances, but they had felt that this was only a temporary arrangement. They had kept their hope and optimism. Now there was nothing but debt and disaster ahead, and Mark Twain could not face returning to Europe and telling Livy and the children the facts. He had to force himself to go back, explaining as cautiously as he could. Olivia saw the truth immediately. The family moved to humble rooms in Munich, and Mark returned to New York once more to see what he could do. Then the worst moment of despair, an admirer came to his aid. H. Rogers of the Standard Oil Company heard from a friend of Mark Twain's plight and came to offer his services. He took over the tangled finances of the writer and immediately began to make some sense out of them. He held hopes that the typesetting machine might be their salvation. He saw that the machine promised to save endless hours of labor and could greatly speed up the printing success. It was delicate, contrary mechanism, but if it could be made to work, Rogers felt that Mark would make a fortune. He renewed Mark's confidence in the invention and arranged to have a demonstration of its wonders in the Times Herald building in Chicago. Rogers had less hope of salvaging and publishing house, but he said he would do what he could. He started by selling the Library of American Literature and saved the company from immediate bankruptcy. Mark Twain, encouraged, began to write again, free for a time from the warriors which had nagged him. He finished Pudd'nhead Wilson and wrote some short stories and articles, feeling that he could now at last finish his book on Joan of Arc. He returned to Europe and his family to tell them the good news. He had scarcely landed and started working in earnest when the Webster Publishing Company went bankrupt. The disaster which had been postponed was now a reality. Rogers' attempt to salvage what he could. He named Mrs. Clemens chief creditor, thereby saving Mark Twain's future royalties. If the creditors had claimed any royalties that Mark made in the future, the family would have been without any means of resources. The creditors received shares of the company, and Rogers told them a payment of 50 cents on the dollar would eventually be made. Rogers himself hoped with Mark Twain that the typesetting machine would save them, but in the end it proved hopelessly unreliable and had to be given up. There was now no other illusion that Mark Twain could hang on to. He knew then that he would have to write himself out of debt and disgrace, just as years before General Grant had done. If Grant had done it, ill as he was, Mark Twain, could do it. Remembering his father, who had refused to turn his back on a debt of honor, remembering General Grant, who had redeemed his own honor, Mark Twain made his decision. The creditors would be paid in full, a full dollar for every dollar that was owed. Rogers agreed. He said, "Business has its laws and customs, and they are justified, but a literary man's reputation is his life. He can afford to be money poor, but he cannot afford to be character poor. You must earn the cent per cent and pay it." Later, Mark Twain overheard Rogers and two other men talking. "How old is Clemens?" the first man asked. 58, Rogers replied. 95% of the men who fail at 58 never get up again, the first man predicted. "You can make it 98% and be nearer right," the second said. There were 96 creditors. Mark Twain was no longer young, and his decision to repay each of his creditors in full meant he would have to leave his family and go back to lecturing, where he had always made money. This time he would make a world tour. Livy, seeing the depths of her husband's determination, decided to go with him. They spent 2 months at their beloved quarry farm, getting ready for the departure. Susie and Jean were to be left behind, but Clara, then 21, would accompany them. Only on July 15, 1895, Mark Twain, Olivia, and Clara started on a lecture tour around the world that would accumulate enough money to redeem the family honor. The story of that 14 months tour is recorded in Mark Twain's book, Following the Equator. While he relates many of his adventures and tells of the countries he visited, he does not tell of the huge crowds that flocked to his lectures. He was making money and he was repaying his debts. He had given himself 2 years to pay off his creditors, and now he was near the end of his obligations. In spite of his weariness, he felt a sense of accomplishment. It was a long, hard trip, but at the end of 1898, Rogers cabled the family in Vienna that creditors have all been paid 100 cents on the dollar. There is $18,500 left. What shall I do with it? Mark Twain wired back. Put it in Federal Steel. In 2 months, he had a profit of 125%. He was free of financial worries at last. Jean and Susie were to be reunited with the family in England, and All during the trip, Livy and he had comforted themselves by saying, "When we get to England." But when they got to England, neither of the girls were there to meet them. They found a letter instead saying that Susie had been taken ill. Frantic, they sent a wire to find out what was the matter. But Livy was so alarmed that she decided to leave with Clara the next day without waiting for an answer. The day that she left, Mark Twain received a cable that his favorite daughter had died. I was standing in our dining room thinking of nothing in particular, Mark Twain wrote in his autobiography, when a cablegram was put into my hand. It said, "Susie was peacefully released today." It is one of the mysteries of our nature that a man, all unprepared, can receive a thunderstroke like that and live. There is but one reasonable explanation of it. The intellect is stunned by the shock and but gropingly gathers the meaning of the words. The power to realize their full import is mercifully wanting. The mind has a dumb sense of vast loss. That is all. It will be. It will take mind and memory months and possibly years to gather together the details and thus learn and know the whole extent of the loss. Livy and Clara were on the high seas. There was no way to get the news to them. Mark Twain in England had to wait day after day, imagining the two of them landing in America to receive that dreadful shock. Mrs. Crane, Susie's aunt, was with her when she died. At the time when Livy and Clara had sailed for America, no one realized how ill Susie was. She had a sudden attack of meningitis and died 3 days later. She had been blinded by the disease and her last words has been "Mama," running her fingers over Mrs. Crane's face, and in her delirium, believing that her mother had somehow got to her side. For a time, both Mark Twain and his wife gave way to despair. Not even the knowledge that they had paid all their debts could cheer them. Then Orion died and then fell ill. And Jean fell ill with a strange series of fits, which was finally diagnosed as epilepsy. Mark Twain felt that if he could just get his family back to Hartford, things might be better. He remembered how he and Livy had said, "When we get to London," and he remembered the doctor's report from Sweden that Jean could not be cured. He saw the changes the past years had made in his wife. All the traveling on the lecture tour and had exhausted her. Then the news of Susie's death. Jean's illness had come on top of that, and he knew that he must face the fact that Lee was now almost completely an invalid. He felt old and tired and discouraged, but he tried to keep up his spirits for his beloved Livy. "When we get to Hartford," he said again and again, at the turn of century the family started home. For the first time in months, they began to act like themselves. They laughed and chattered, looking forward to seeing old friends, to being in big old house in Hartford, to being financially secure with the money from Mark's books. True, things had changed drastically. Susie was gone. Susie, whom they had loved with all their hearts. Livy was an invalid. Jean was ill, but that word that he used to comfort his heart again and again. But Mark Twain's return to New York from his tour, world tour was a hero's return. All the newspapers were full of his courage in repaying his debt. People everywhere praised and saluted him. His name was on everybody's lips. He was an American hero come home to receive his honors. The noise and excitement told on Livy. Mark finally realized that they could never go back to the big house in Hartford. It would simply be too much for his frail wife. They tried a summer in the Adirondacks, but Livy failed to rally. Finally, the family found a house in Riverdale on Hudson, and there they settled into a subdued but reasonably happy life. It could never be the old life, but now Mark Twain was realizing that nothing could ever bring back his past, but it was somewhere, even if he forgot it now and then. It was in his books forever. He was given honor after honor, including a degree from Yale University. The boy who had skipped school was now a doctor. He spoke often at banquets, and he was always being asked for articles and stories, but Livy was not responding as he had hoped, and finally in 1903 he yielded to the advice of doctors and took her to Italy, where he thought the warm sunshine might help her. Ill as Livy was, Mark never lost hope. The villa in Florence to which the Twains went was damp and depressing, but Livy and Mark tried to keep up their spirits. One day she looked up at him and said, "You believe I shall get well?" Mark Twain went cold. It was the first time in his life that he had ever heard his wife utter any kind of despair. He realized at that moment that she herself had given up hope of ever being well again. He clung to the idea that if he could get Livy away from the damp villa where they were living, she would improve. At last, after several months of searching, he found a place that he thought was perfect for an invalid. By this time, Livy was so weak that he was only allowed to see her for 15 minutes 2 or 3 times during a day, and he was bursting with the good news when he got home. At 7 that evening, he wrote, "I was at the bedside. I described the villa, exhibited its plants, and said we would buy it tomorrow if she were willing, and move her to it as soon as she could bear the journey." She was pleased. She was satisfied, and her face now white, marble white, these latter weeks was radiant. During the afternoon of June 5th, 1904, the villa had a special warmth. Hope was in the air. Clara and Jean and Mark had left as if a fresh start were about to be made. Clara himself had said of her mother, "She is better today than she has been for 3 months." And Jean and her father agreed. As 7 at 7, Mark Twain went in to visit his wife. She was so bright and happy that he could not tear himself away from her, even though he knew that he was not supposed to make his visits long, and Livy herself was uplifted at the thought of the new home that would soon be in. She insisted on talking, although talking had been strictly forbidden her because it taxed her strength too much. Instead of the usual 15 minutes, Mark Twain spent half an hour with his wife. Then, feeling guilty, he started to leave, saying that he had been carried away by her own high spirits and had forgotten the time. He was afraid that he had tired her, but she would not listen to his apologies. "You will come back?" she asked, for at 9:30 every night he always came to say good night. Mark Twain went to his room, his heart bursting with happiness. For the first time in 22 months, he felt that Livy would get better. Finally, so exhilarated by his own hopes for the future, he went to perform an act he had not done in years. In his own words, "I did a thing which I have hardly done since we lost our incomparable Susie 8 years ago, whose death made a wound in her mother's heart which never healed. I went to the piano and sang the old songs, the quaint Negro hymns, which no one cared for when I sang them except Susie and her mother. When I sang them, Susie always came and listened. When she died, my interest in them passed away. I could not put force and feeling into them without the inspiration of her approving presence. But now the force and feeling were all back in full strength, and I was all alive, and it was as if 8 years had fallen from me. In the midst of my Lord, he called me. He called me by the thunder." Jean crept into the room and sat down. To my astonishment and embarrassment, and I stopped. But when she asked me to go on, only the astonishment remained, and it was a pleasant one and inspiring. With great difficulty, I brought up little by little the forgotten words of many songs, and Jean remained until a servant came and called her out. After a time, Mark Twain stopped playing. It was near 9:30 and time to say good night to his wife. He was thinking to himself that he would tell Livy that Jean had come in to listen to the old spirituals. In his mind, he thought of the words he would use to his wife. "Livy, Jean has paid me a compliment which I have not had since we last." Then he stopped in the middle of the thought. If he said that, he would remind Livy of Susie's death. There were so many things that could not be said these days. But Livy had heard the singing. At 9:15, she had looked up and said to the nurse, "He is singing a good night carol for me." The next meant while he was on the stairs on his way up to bid her good night, she died.